Would you agree that those crimes are wantonly vile or inhuman?
I won't disagree.
Quiet residential neighborhood. A series of brutally violent, horrible crimes have been committed. And yet the police and prosecutor in this town seem either unable or unwilling to draw the obvious connection between what happened here and Satanism.
Hi everyone, my name's Emily. Thank you for clicking onto my video. Now today's case is of a serial killer who very much reminded me of Jeffrey Dahmer. Now if you're a true crimer, you know exactly what this man done. Now let's just jump into it. Robert Andrew Bedella Jr. was born on the 31st of January 1949. Robert was known as Bob, so that's what we're going to be calling him today. Bob was the eldest of two sons and he was raised in Ohio. He was raised in a very, very strict Catholic household. His father worked at Ford Motor Company and his mother was a household wife. Bob's father was known to be very disappointed with Bob, as his dad was very, very sports motivated, but Bob wasn't. He had two left legs, so to speak, so he couldn't or wouldn't have a relationship with him. But when Bob turned 16 years old, his father died unexpectedly of a heart attack. And soon after, his mother had remarried, but had left him behind and carried on with her new life. In 1967, Bob had graduated high school and he enrolled himself into Kansas City Art Institute. Bob was actually quite talented, but his arts weren't exactly for the faint-hearted. He mostly used live animals in his sick and twisted projects. And with his art not being understood, Bob left college. He then started to abuse and sell drugs. At this stage of his life, he started to explore his sexuality, finding out that he was actually gay. With him being raised in such a strict Catholic household, there was no way that his family would accept this, so he just kept it quiet. Bob was good at many things, but selling drugs weren't one of them, and that abruptly ended when he told an undercover police officer that he sold amphetamines. The idiot had bagged himself a 5-year suspended sentence. After getting caught, Bob knew that he needed to get a job, and he actually managed to get himself a job as a short order chef. He very quickly developed a reputation within the community, as they were just raving about how good his food was. He made enough money to the point he was able to buy a house, and this is the house where the horrors happened. Soon after, he started to collect valuable arts and antiques, which then led him to start a stall calling it Bob's Bizarre Bazaar, selling all the art and all the antiques that he could get his hands on. Eventually, the stall began to be Bob's full-time job. He also started letting out some of the rooms just to make ends meet. Some of the men that he had rented rooms to were quite vulnerable young men, and in exchange for bed and board, they'd do odd jobs around the house and even on his stall. By 1984, Bob's house began to look a bit like a warehouse, like things absolutely everywhere. It was just a state. His behaviour then started to change. He started to act really odd. He started to despise the men that he brought in exchange for bed and board, who internally was helping him. In March of that year, Bob began a relationship with former sex worker 19-year-old Jerry Howell. Bob knew Jerry and his dad Paul while working on a stall, as Paul had actually had a stall himself. 5th of July 1984, Bob had promised Jerry that he'd take him to a dancing contest in Merriam. But in fact, he'd actually abducted Jerry without Jerry really even picking up on what Bob was doing. He drank the alcohol and took the drugs that Bob had plied him with. He had said to investigators that he had not only given him drugs in the car, but he'd given him drugs at his home. And then when he was completely knocked unconscious, he injected him with tranquilizer, before Jerry painfully endured 27 hours of being raped by that monster. He only stopped to go to work, and when he came back again, that hell for Jerry started all over again. Bob had again injected Jerry to get him in a docile state to be able to do whatever he wanted with him. And again, he painfully endured hours and hours of Bob raping him. He also hit Jerry time and time again with a metal ruler. Jerry had sadly passed away through being repeatedly raped and tortured, while this sick fuck had documented every detail and even taken pictures during the rape, torture and murder of Jerry Howell. He then drained all the blood from Jerry's body, dismembered him and put the pieces into black bags. He then left them out for the bin men, who were actually due the next day.
Dahmer had a complete disregard for human life, and I think what he was always aiming for was to create this compliant, docile sex slave.
Now who does that remind you of? Only Jeffrey freaking Dahmer. Now, I done some digging into both of their cases, and the similarities between them are very uncanny. Like, it makes you think, did they copy one another? I'll go into more of my conspiracy theory at the end of the video, but let's just get back to this case. Jerry's dad had reported him missing on the 8th of July 1984. Bob was interviewed by police, being the last person to have seen Jerry, but let's face it, regardless of whether he was involved or not, being the last person to see Jerry, he would have been interviewed anyway. He had told police that he was with Jerry that night, but he had in fact dropped him off at the 7-Eleven store. And let's face it, Bob's been an upstanding member of the community, a weird one, but he's not given anyone any reason to believe that he's dangerous. So with all that in mind, police had no reason to suspect him of any wrongdoing, and off he went on his merry way. Not long after that, a former boarder to Bob had come forward and said that he'd believed him to give Jerry a hot shot. Now, if you don't know what a hot shot is, it's an enormous amount of a drug like heroin. Even if you are a taker or a user, it's so much that your body actually can't handle it, and it's lethal and you die. Jerry's body was never found to either confirm or deny this, or even to confirm the fact that he was dead. Bob was put under surveillance by the police, but with no evidence or no body to support that Jerry was dead or alive, there was nothing that the police could do. Jerry's dad had known full well that Bob had killed his son, but he couldn't prove it. I truly feel for his dad, knowing that this monster had got away with his son's murder. 9 months after getting away with killing Jerry, Bob had a former boarder come back to the house as he'd had an argument with his girlfriend. This was 20-year-old Robert Sheldon. Literally, the moment that Robert had walked through his door was the exact moment that Bob knew that he was his next victim, and he injected him with a load of drugs. At this time, the torture had got worse, and he decided that he was going to inject drain cleaner into his eyes. I mean, what even made him think of that? He also filled his ears with caulking material and then attacked him with a piano wire. You can see the extensive wounds on his hands. I mean, I won't be showing these pictures. I mean, if you want to take and look at these pictures, by all means, but I won't be showing them on here. Robert was hit multiple times with the rubber mallet, but this was all an attempt to subdue his victim, which made no sense, because he himself had said to investigators that he wasn't even physically attractive to Robert, so he just tortured him. He didn't even rape him. I really don't even know whether he was lucky or not. I can't even wrap my head around the last few days that Robert had actually had on this earth. Again, the sick fuck had documented every detail, taken pictures, all of Robert's ordeal. This went on for 4 long days. He literally only took this man's life because on the 14th of April 1985, Bob had a workman that he knew was coming over, but he was doing work on his roof. So he got scared and decided this was it. So he placed a plastic bag over Robert's head and held it there until he was dead. He then drained the blood and dismembered his body, and he too was left out for the bin men, all except for his head, which he buried in his garden. And we can only assume he done this to keep that as a trophy. The deranged psychopath has now got away with murdering 2 people. 2 months later, Bob needed to feed his urge again, and he'd so happened to come across 20-year-old Mark Wallace. He was literally pissed as a fart in his shed. Mark had done odd jobs around the house and the stall for Bob, so Mark wasn't exactly a random person. Bob invites Mark in, and yes, you guessed it, he injects him before he ties him up and rapes him too. He also stepped it up a notch, and although he kept the rubber mallet, his next sick thought was to electrocute Mark. But remember, through all of this, Bob is still trying to look like an upstanding member of the community, and off he goes to work. When Bob had returned home from work, he had actually found Mark trying to escape, so he quickly got on to injecting, raping and torturing him again. Bob had documented everything that he had put Mark through, and on the 23rd of June 1985, he had wrote a note in his diary stating, "No sign of life, 7 a.m. Mark had died as a result of all the pain that Bob had inflicted on him. Again, draining his body of all his blood and dismembering him with a safety razor, a knife and a saw. He separated his body parts and he too went out for the bin men. 3 men now dead at the hands of Bob Bedella. Bob had gained a reputation amongst the sex working community that he was being very aggressive and wanting to tie them up and essentially rape them, which in all books, no amount of money is going to make you want to sleep with Bob Bedella. He was also very well known for going to gay bars. My only guess is to pick off his next victim. But despite his reputation, this man was still trusted by some. And on the 26th of February 1985, James Ferris had turned up to Bob Bedella's house. He knew Bob from years back, but he either didn't hear about the rumours or simply didn't believe the rumours. Either way, that sealed his fate, and the moment that James walked through his door, Bob struck again. He laced James's meal with drugs, and the moment he was out, he tied him up and raped him. Once he satisfied himself in that way, he moved on to his more sadistic side, and Bob Bedella began to torture James. Bob had still kept the electrocution and electrocuted James by his shoulders and his testicles for up to 5 minutes at a time. But he wasn't done there, and he ramped it up a notch and injected James with ketamine, which is a tranquilizer. So on top of all the hell that he was going through, this gives you hallucinations. So again, on top of all the hell that he was going through, who knows what he would have actually been seeing? As always, Bob had documented every detail, taking photos of all of James's ordeal. Some of his notes read, unable to sit up for 10-15 seconds, very delayed breathing, and the final note he wrote about him was 86, which is a slang word from his chefing days meaning stop the project or throw it out. He then dismembered James's body in the bathtub, and he too went out for the bin men in black bags. Days after James's disappearance, his wife reported him missing. His mother and his wife knew that Bob was responsible because that was the last place he was. That was what he told his wife when he left, "I'm going to Bob Bedella's house." In just over a year, Bob Bedella had maliciously killed 4 men, and yet the police was none the wiser that Bob had any involvement. Bob's next target was Todd Stoops. Bob knew Todd and his wife through living with him, but he lived with him in return for sexual favours. But Todd's wife did actually know about this arrangement, but I'm assuming with nowhere else to go, you gotta do what you gotta do. But again, Bob taking advantage of the vulnerable. Bob hadn't seen Todd in a very long time, but he so happened to bump into him at Kansas City Memorial Park on the 17th of June 1986. Bob knew the moment he saw Todd, he was his next victim. He had such a strong attraction to Todd, which he even told the investigators. He invited Todd back for a spot of lunch and actually to earn a bit of money for his sexual services because he wanted drugs. But he too was drugged up, and the beginning of 2 weeks of pure hell for Todd Stoops was just about to begin. Bob raped Todd constantly throughout the 2-week period that he had abducted him. He had also injected drain cleaner into his voice box to silence him. He also electrocuted his eyes in an attempt to blind him. Bob had barely fed Todd throughout the whole 2-week ordeal, and during the 2nd week, Todd had asked him for a sandwich and something to drink, which Bob refused him. Todd couldn't contain his emotions any longer and burst into tears. I can't even begin to imagine the torture he was put through, let alone not even being able to drink or eat. And on the 27th of June, Bob had caused Todd's anal wall to rupture and bleed quite badly. Bob eventually gave in and tried to feed him some ice cream and some soup, but by then it was too late, because Todd wasn't able to keep anything down. documented by Bob himself. He had taken a fair few photos more of Todd than the rest of his victims. We can only assume that his attraction to Todd was more stronger. And on the 1st of July 1986, Todd had died from septic shock from the rupture. Bob had even told investigators that Todd wasn't even able to breathe in a sitting position that day. Less than a year later, Bob Bedella was out for another victim, and on the 23rd of June 1987, he bailed Larry Pearson out of jail. But in return, he had to come to Bob's house, and spend a few days. They became quite friendly when Larry went into Bob's Bizarre Bazaar. This turned into quite a casual friendship, but Larry's call to Bob for help would be the biggest mistake, as Bob had waited for Larry to get drunk that night and injected him with clomazepine. Once Larry had been drugged, Bob had then dragged him down to the basement and tied him up with his hands above his head. He then tied the rope he was bound with to a column to be able to keep him in place. This was done so he could easily inject drain cleaner into Larry's voice box to prevent him from screaming. Larry was then put through 6 weeks of this fucking demon's torture. In the first 5 days, Larry had been repeatedly raped by him. He had been electrocuted. He had also had multiple bones broken with this metal rod. He whacked him and whacked him and whacked him just to get him to be compliant. Larry had succumbed to Bob's abuse and didn't fight him off, which actually earned some trust with Bob. And as a reward, he was able to leave the basement and move upstairs with him. Bob had stated to Larry that if he carried on doing what he was told, that he wouldn't inflict so much pain on him. As in Bob's eyes, this was the only victim that was compliant enough to last longer than 2 weeks. After 6 weeks of enduring pain day in, day out, Larry made the worst but most heroic decision of his life. And when being forced to give Bob Bedella oral sex, Larry had bit down as hard as he could. How was that for karma, mate? Larry had badly hurt Bob, and he had no choice but to go to hospital, but not before retaliating back. He had hit Larry over the head, knocking him unconscious. He then suffocated him by putting a bag over his head and a ligature around his throat and pulled until he was dead. Then, and only then, did Bob go to the hospital, which he was actually told that he needed surgery for his injuries. Bob had to go back and deal with Larry's body first, so he told the hospital that he needed to go back and feed his animals. Bob had done his usual and dismembered Larry's body, but kept his head and placed it into a plastic bag, storing it in the freezer before being buried out in the garden. His body parts went out for the bin men to take, and off Bob went to receive his treatment. Less than a year later, obviously healed from his injuries, Bob felt the urge to be a sadistic, perverted fucking demon again. He had lured 22-year-old Christopher Bryson in. He had promised him money in return for sexual favours. And Christopher went back with Bob to his house. And this time, there was no injecting him. There was no waiting for him to get drunk. He rendered Christopher unconscious by whacking him round the head with an iron bar. Bob had then tied Christopher to his bed, where he repeatedly raped him. Bob had electrocuted him. He also swabbed ammonia into his eyes. And while doing this, he said to Christopher, "The only thing you need to worry about, mate, is me, you, and this house." I'd rather not, to be honest, mate. And just like Larry, after a certain amount of days, Bob started to trust Christopher. He started to discuss about reducing the amount of pain he was inflicting on him. But the sexual abuse remained, and this wasn't up for discussion. He told him that he'd got this far with other people, but they're dead now because of the mistakes that they made. Day 3 of Christopher's abduction, he had gained Bob's trust, and he had asked him if he could have his hands forward instead of behind him, which Bob actually allowed him to have. The next day, on the 2nd of April 1988, Bob had accidentally left some matches in the reach of Christopher, and he quietly and quickly got to burning his bounds off. Once he was free, he done what I think most of us, or all of us, would have done, and he jumped out of a 2nd floor window with nothing but a dog collar on. Surprisingly, he only broke one bone doing this, but he legged it across the road, and he see a meter man working on this house, and he frantically said, "Call the police, call the police." But the homeowner of the house had called the police. They arrived within minutes, and finally, the reign of terror of Bob Bedella was finally over. When Bob returned home from work that day, he was met by police and quickly arrested. They asked Bob if they could search around the place, as the warrant actually hadn't been drawn up yet, but Bob refused and he asked for a lawyer. Bob was then brought back to Kansas City jail and interviewed. They also managed to get a statement from Christopher Bryson, and with that alone, they was able to get a warrant to search Bob Bedella's home. When they first arrived to his home, they could hear dogs behind the door, so they had to get animal control out to deal with the situation properly. Once that was done, they entered the house, and police was shocked as shit, to say the least. Bob's house was a complete and utter state. Their first thought was to get to the bedroom that Christopher had been abducted in for the past 4 days and just gain any evidence that they could from him being there. When they walked in, they found the bed that Christopher had described. They also found the bands that he had burnt off just hanging off the bed. Underneath the bed was an electrocuting device that was plugged into the wall. It had jumper cables attached to it, giving him the opportunity to electrocute his victim when and where he wanted to. Throughout the search, police had come across Bob's trophies, his Polaroid picture collection. These pictures are all of his 7 victims throughout their torture, rape, and 6 of them being successfully murdered. They had also uncovered Bob's notebook that contained all the notes of him torturing and raping each victim. Another officer had found a skull in his closet. They also came across a bag that appeared to be vertebrae, but this stunned police because they were quite clean. They almost looked like they were fake, they were that clean, only suggesting that Bob had cleaned them. This was just the first day of Bob's arrest. The next day, when investigators returned, they left no stone unturned. Throughout the search, one officer had gone into the garden and he had noticed that some patches of the grass were greener than the others. This piqued his interest. He had this dug up and they found yet another skull. The police had got an extended search onto Bob's bizarre bazaar, and when they arrived, they noticed these skulls on display. At first they thought they were plastic, but no, these skulls were real. They were the skulls of Bob Bedella's victims. The 2 skulls that were found in his house and in his garden were believed to be the skulls of Larry Pearson and Robert Sheldon. This sick fuck had been decapitating his victims, burying them in his garden, and when he thought it was enough time, he'd dig them back up, clean them up, and put them on display. 3rd of August 1998, Bob Bedella had shocked everybody when he appeared at the Jackson County Courthouse. He was being charged of the first-degree murder of Larry, but Bob Bedella had pled guilty, which was only a calculated move because it would only prevent him from getting the death penalty. He was scared of the graceful death that he would have gotten. Well, none of your victims got that. When it came time for prosecutors to charge Bob Bedella with the murder of Robert Sheldon, Bob again pleaded guilty. He wanted to make a deal, and he sat down with the 2 prosecutors and the 2 defence attorneys that he had, and he told them everything, all that he'd done to every single one of these men. He was like getting some sort of kick out of it, reliving every single moment. And when these 2 unforgettable days were over, prosecutors should have done it like they'd done back in the day, literally took his head. But Bob Bedella had been spared his life, the privilege he didn't give not one of his victims. And on the 19th of December, Bob Bedella was sentenced to 2 life sentences for first-degree murder and 4 conditional life sentences for second-degree murder. I wish I could tell you he lived a long life in there, and this makes me sad more than I can say, but the little slimeball died and got away with it on the 8th of October 1992. Spending just over 3 years in prison wasn't enough time to pay back for all the crimes he committed. But in turn, I guess we can look at it as he received the death penalty regardless. And that's today's case, guys. What's your thoughts? What's your opinions? I'd love to hear them down in the comment box. Bob Bedella is probably the worst case that I've covered to date. For the people who stay in to hear my conspiracy theory on Bob Berdella and Jeffrey Dahmer, I will tell you in just a minute. But for the people who don't, I'd like to thank you for watching my video, and I hope to see you in another one. For anyone who stayed, this is just my opinion, so don't come for me. But what I came across is that Jeffrey Dahmer had taken the life of Stephen Hicks in 1978. He had only taken one victim. Bob, on the other hand, had taken the life of Jerry Howell in 1984. Now, Bob had raped, tortured and murdered 6 men by the time that Jeffrey Dahmer had murdered his next victim. Bob had killed his last victim in July of 1987, whereas Jeffrey Dahmer had killed his second victim in November of 1987. I also found out that they lived just over 500 miles away from each other. Now, I know there weren't no social media back then, but there was TVs, news reports, newspapers. You can't tell me that Jeffrey Dahmer hadn't heard what Bob Berdella had done. By the time that Jeffrey had made his next kill in 1987, he too tried to make a docile sex slave. Now, they may not have done everything exactly the same, but the similarities are so uncanny. I don't know. What do you think? What's your thoughts? What's your opinions? Again, I'd love to hear them down in the comment box. But for today, that's me out. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in another one. Bye!